On October 13th, 1983, the first cold snap rolled off Lake Erie and turned downtown Cleveland into a glassy, wind-carved corridor of headlights and breath. The kind of night when a bar's front door never shuts cleanly, when the hinge complains, the neon hums a half-note lower, and every stranger comes in wearing the same excuse. Warmth? Jack Rourke had been behind the wood long enough to know the city by what it ordered. The steel guys came in hungry and loud. The courthouse clerks drank careful. The salesmen tried to buy confidence by the ounce. And the ones who were lying always did one thing wrong. They made their routine too perfect. He was wiping rings off the varnish when the man in the gray coat arrived, exactly as the wall clock above the back mirror clicked over to 9:17. Not late, not early. Like a train schedule, the coat was civilian. The shoes were ordinary. The hair was unremarkable in a way that felt chosen. He paused just long enough for his eyes to take inventory. Door, windows, the slice of street reflected in the mirror. Then he moved to the third stool from the end, the seat that gave him the cleanest line on the entrance without looking like he cared. "Evening," Jack said, because that was the job. Because you could greet anyone and still keep your distance. The man nodded once, the smallest acceptable acknowledgement. His hands stayed out of his pockets. His fingers were clean, nails cut short. He didn't glance at the bourbon shelf the way bourbon men did. He didn't scan the beer taps the way indecisive men did. He looked straight at Jack's face like he was confirming a photograph. "Bourbon," he said. Then, with the same calm cadence every time, like a phrase he'd practiced so it couldn't be misheard. "Neat." 2 ice cubes on the side. It wasn't the request that bothered Jack at first. People ordered stupid things all the time. It was the precision. Neat meant no ice. 2 cubes on the side meant a second glass, a second surface, a second set of fingerprints, a second object on the bar that could be touched, moved, taken away without anyone thinking twice. It was an order built like a diagram. Jack poured a measure of Old Crow, set it down. He added a rocks glass with 2 cubes and a cocktail napkin, because that's what you did. He slid the drink across the varnish and watched the man's eyes flick, not to the whiskey, but to the napkin. Jack had the sudden, irrational sense that if he changed one tiny thing, if he swapped the napkin for a coaster, if he put the ice on the left instead of the right, something invisible would fail to click into place. The man didn't drink. He rested his fingertips on the edge of the napkin, as if it were fragile. He waited with his body still, only the faintest movement in his throat, like he was counting in his head. The bar kept moving around him. 2 college kids arguing over the jukebox. A couple tucked into a booth pretending they weren't fighting. A regular laughing too hard at his own story. But the man in gray stayed inside his own quiet. Then the front door opened again. A woman stepped in carrying a department store bag, her hair pinned up against the wind, cheeks pink from the cold. She shook snow off her sleeves and walked to the far end near the payphone. Not the bar. She didn't look at the man in gray. She didn't look at Jack. She asked no one for anything. She just stood there a moment as if she were waiting for someone who was late. The man in gray lifted his bourbon for the first time, not to drink, just to move. He raised it, took a sip that barely wet his mouth, and set the glass down again with careful softness. His eyes stayed on the mirror behind the bar, and in that mirror Jack watched the woman shift her department store bag from one hand to the other, the paper handles creasing as if she'd been told to hold it that way. Jack felt the hairs on his arms rise, not from fear exactly, but from the wrongness of a pattern beginning to show itself. He'd seen men make signals before. Bartenders learned them without realizing. Wedding rings on and off. A glance toward the door. The way a guy would scratch his jaw right before someone slipped out the back. But this was cleaner, more surgical. 2 strangers moving in the same rhythm while pretending not to share the same air. The man in gray reached for the ice glass and rotated it a quarter turn, just enough to shift the cubes against the side. The sound was small, an innocent clink swallowed by the jukebox and the noise of the room. He left a folded bill under the bourbon, untouched by his bare skin because it sat beneath the napkin. He stood, put his coat back on without haste, and walked out as if he had somewhere he'd promised to be. The woman waited 3 more seconds. then crossed to the bar with an expression that tried hard to be casual. "Could I get a club soda?" she asked. Voice light, eyes on Jack's hands instead of his face. Jack reached for a glass. Hearing the old hinges of the door settle back into place behind the man in gray, he placed the soda in front of her and watched her fingers move, not to the drink, but to the napkin where the bill lay. She didn't take the money. She took the napkin, and as she lifted it, Jack saw something he would have missed on any other night. A tiny dent in the paper where a hard edge had pressed through, like something thin and rectangular had been hiding there, held flat against the varnish by nothing more than courtesy and habit. The woman slid the napkin into her bag, sipped her soda once, and left the bar without finishing it, as if the taste had never mattered. Jack stood there with his bar rag in his hand, staring at the empty space where the napkin had been, feeling the room keep laughing and singing around him like nothing had happened. He told himself automatically that it was none of his business, that people passed notes all the time, that maybe it was a debt, a lover, a joke, but his mouth felt dry. And his instincts, those simple working instincts that had kept him alive in the service and paid his rent behind this counter, kept whispering the same ugly thought. That drink order hadn't been an order at all. It had been a key, and his bar had just turned in the lock. The next night, Jack told himself he was being ridiculous because that's what you told yourself in a city built on noise. Patterns happened. Coincidences stacked. People were private in ways that weren't your concern. He said it the way a man says a prayer he doesn't believe in, polishing the same spot of varnish until the wood warmed under his palm, until the bar looked normal enough to trust. But normal had a way of arriving late. At 9:70, the door opened again. Same gray coat, same third stool, same pause in the threshold, 2 heartbeats of inventory before he moved as if the room had been measured and memorized. Jack felt an irritation sharpen into something closer to dread, not because he was afraid of the man, but because he hated how cleanly the man could repeat himself. A regular's habits were sloppy. A drunk's were sloppy. This wasn't sloppy. Bourbon, the man said. Voice level. Neat. 2 ice cubes on the side. Jack didn't answer right away. He let the bar's noise fill the gap. He watched the man's eyes stay politely fixed on his face, unblinking, as if silence was something he could wait out forever. Jack set down a single glass. Neat, he said, and poured the bourbon. No second glass. No ice. No napkin. A flicker ran across the man's expression, too fast for anyone, but someone trained to watch faces for a living. It wasn't anger. It was recalculation. A micro-adjustment that made Jack's stomach knot, because it confirmed what his instincts had already guessed. The details mattered. The man didn't protest. He didn't correct Jack. He smiled like a man humoring a bartender's stubbornness. And that smile was wrong, too, an imitation of warmth with no heat behind it. "Of course," he said softly, and took a sip. Jack waited for the woman with the department store bag. He waited for any echo of last night's choreography, for a step toward the payphone, a shift of paper handles, something. Nothing happened. Instead, a different man entered, a heavy-set guy in a brown shearling jacket, cheeks raw from the wind, carrying the smell of cold air and cigarettes. He walked straight to the payphone like he belonged there, dropped in a coin, and dialed with his back turned to the room. He didn't look at the bar. He didn't look at the gray coat. Jack almost relaxed, until he caught the smallest motion in the mirror. The gray coat man's left hand moving under the bar's edge as if he were smoothing his trousers. A simple adjustment, except Jack saw the finger tap. Once, twice. Pause. Then once again against his own thigh. A rhythm, not a nervous habit. A cadence in the booth near the back. The jukebox coughed and switched songs mid-verse like someone had kicked it. The shearling jacket man's shoulders tightened at the exact same moment, as if he'd heard something he'd been waiting for through all the wrong noise. He hung up the phone without finishing the call, left the receiver swaying slightly, and walked out. The gray coat man finished his bourbon in 3 slow swallows. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed, and stood. He left a bill on the bar with the same careful placement as before, though this time there was no napkin to insulate it. He made sure his fingerprints were on it, a deliberate smear of proof. He stepped toward the door, paused, and glanced back, not at Jack's face, but at Jack's hands, as if checking whether Jack had done what he was supposed to do. Then he was gone. Jack stared at the money, at the wet ring of bourbon on the varnish, at the ordinary world continuing to breathe around him. A couple at the far end laughed. Someone shouted for another round. The ceiling fan clicked. Jack took the bill and felt something catch under his thumb, a slight stiffness at the edge, like the paper had been folded around something and then flattened again. He brought it closer under the bar light, hiding it behind his forearm the way he'd learned to hide cigarettes in the service, and saw the faintest raised outline pressed into the fibers, a rectangle smaller than a matchbook, thinner than common sense. He looked up. No one was watching him, which meant, in a way that made his mouth go dry, that someone was. Jack didn't know KGB or CIA. He didn't know codes or couriers. He knew pores and tells and the difference between a man who came to drink and a man who came to use a room. And he knew one other thing now, with sudden clarity that felt like stepping off a curb and realizing there's no streetlight. Last night, the bar had been the handoff. Tonight, the bar had been the test, and he had just failed it. He slid the bill into his pocket instead of the register and forced himself to keep moving, to keep smiling, to keep asking what people wanted, like the answer mattered. While his mind ran circles around one question he couldn't stop hearing. If they noticed he changed the rules, what else would they notice? Behind him, the payphone receiver swung once more and settled into silence, and Jack realized that the bar wasn't just a place where people hid from the cold. It was a place where someone had learned how to hide in plain sight and how to punish anyone who disturbed the pattern. At 10:03, Jack's hands were still steady enough to work, but his thoughts had started to move like a rat in a wall. Fast, blind, desperate for an exit. He didn't do anything dramatic. He didn't slam a drawer or announce a problem. He didn't even look at the door more than anyone else would. He simply started listening the way a bartender learns to listen when a fight is about to happen. Less to words, more to the spaces between them. The bar had its own pulse. Ice in glasses, laughter that rose and fell, chairs scraping, the jukebox muttering an old soul song with a voice like smoke. Under that, there was another rhythm now, quieter, not part of the room's natural music. The front door's bell hadn't rung in 10 minutes, but Jack kept hearing it anyway, as if his brain was rehearsing the sound so it would recognize it the moment it returned. He reached for the register and stopped short, fingers hovering over the bills as if the money might bite him. The gray coat's bill was still in his pocket, heavy as a secret. He could feel its edge through the fabric, and every time his hip brushed the bar, he imagined he could hear paper whisper. He poured a beer for a trucker with cracked hands and a tired face. He smiled at a couple sharing a basket of peanuts, like they were holding a marriage together with salt. He wiped the counter in a slow, calm arc that gave him an excuse to watch the mirrors without looking like he was watching the mirrors. The payphone had gone quiet. The receiver sat properly now. Someone had come in and hung it up at some point. Maybe a customer. Maybe Jack. He couldn't remember doing it, which was its own kind of fear. Behind him, the back door clicked. Not opening, not closing, just a click, metal on metal, like a latch tested by fingers that wanted to learn what it would take to break. Jack kept his face neutral and turned to grab a glass from the rack as if he hadn't heard anything at all. In the mirror, the back hallway was a thin rectangle of darkness. No movement, no silhouette. He waited. The click came again. 2 taps. A pause. 1 tap. His throat tightened. It wasn't that he recognized it as code. He didn't have that kind of knowledge. But he recognized it as intention. People didn't test doors and patterns unless patterns mattered. He took a step toward the hallway. 1 step. Casual, like he was checking a spill or looking for a dropped bottle cap, and stopped when he saw the coat hanging on the back hook shift slightly, as if someone had brushed past it without making a sound. The air in the hall smelled colder than the bar, like outside air had been let in and held. Jack's heart climbed into his mouth. He forced it back down with a swallow that felt loud. He walked to the end of the bar and leaned down as if to pick up a fallen napkin. And from that angle, he could see the back door's deadbolt. It was turned halfway, not fully thrown, not fully undone, halfway like a deliberate marker. Jack straightened slowly. His mind supplied an image he didn't want. The gray coat man's eyes tracking Jack's hands, measuring whether Jack followed instructions. The test, the punishment, the invisible rules. A woman at the bar asked for a gin and tonic. Jack made it with the same precision he always used, because his hands only knew one way to move. As he slid it over, he realized the woman's eyes were fixed not on him, but on the hallway behind him, and her face held the kind of blank calm you saw on people waiting for a bus. Patience without curiosity. Then she did something tiny. She adjusted her purse strap, and the metal buckle caught the light in the mirror. A quick flare, a flash that lasted a fraction of a second. The coat on the hook in the hallway shifted again. Jack felt his skin go cold. He wasn't watching a bar anymore. He was watching a mechanism. The woman sipped her drink. She didn't look around. She didn't make conversation. She simply sat there like a placeholder someone had inserted into the room. And Jack understood. Pure instinct. No training that she wasn't here to drink. She was here to be seen. And if she was here to be seen, then someone else was here to see her. The front door opened. Not the gray coat this time. Two men came in together, one tall and narrow, one shorter with a thick neck, dressed like they belonged in any cold city in America. Except they moved with a mirrored discipline, their steps landing almost in sync. They didn't scan the room the way curious strangers did. Their eyes went immediately to the payphone, then to the bar, then, briefly, to the back hallway. Jack's stomach knotted so hard it felt like he might fold in on himself. The taller one smiled at Jack as if they'd met before. "Busy tonight?" he said. Voice friendly, unremarkable. Jack opened his mouth to answer, and nothing came out at first, not because he was shocked, but because his body had decided, without asking him, that every word mattered now. He forced air into his lungs. "Depends," he said finally. The man's smile widened just slightly, and Jack saw, for the first time, the faintest edge of satisfaction, like someone confirming that the machine had started to turn. "Yeah?" the man said. "It does." And as he spoke, the woman with the purse lifted her glass again, and the buckle caught the light one more time, another deliberate flash, aimed straight into the mirror behind Jack's head. A signal? Jack didn't know to whom, but he knew exactly what it meant. Something was about to happen, and whatever it was, his bar was no longer a place where people came to disappear. It was where someone came to be found. The tall man didn't sit. He hovered at the end of the bar like he was waiting for a train schedule to update, one hand resting on the wood as if testing whether it was real. His partner, thick neck, square shoulders, took the nearest stool but kept his knees angled toward the door. Not the bartender, not the room. Jack had seen men like that before. Not cops, not criminals, something in between. Men trained to look like nothing at all. Jack kept moving because stillness would confess. He reached for a clean rocks glass, set it down, wiped a spot that wasn't dirty, and let his eyes flick, only when they had to, toward the mirror behind the bottles. The woman with the purse sat perfectly composed, sipping as if time didn't touch her. She never once turned her head toward the two men, but Jack noticed her reflection shift by a millimeter when they arrived. Not fear, a calibration, like she'd been waiting for the right pieces to enter the frame. The tall man leaned closer, voice low enough that only Jack could hear it over the jukebox. "You got a phone?" he asked. Jack nodded toward the payphone. "Right there." The man smiled, and the smile made Jack's skin crawl because it wasn't for humor. It was for control. Not that one. Jack's throat tightened. He didn't answer fast enough. The thick-necked man spoke, calm as a weather report. "We called earlier. It rang once." Jack felt the words land like a hand around his collar. They weren't asking. They were confirming. "I don't know anything about," Jack started, but the tall man raised a finger, gentle, almost polite. "Easy," he said. "Nobody's accusing you. You're just in the middle of something you don't understand." That was the most terrifying part. How reasonable it sounded. Jack forced a shrug, pretending he was annoyed, not afraid. "I'm in the middle of pouring drinks. That's what I understand." The tall man's eyes moved, not to Jack's face, But to Jack's hands, a bartender's hands told the truth even when the mouth lied, and Jack knew his hands were betraying him. Too careful, too tight around the glass. The tall man nodded as if he'd learned enough. "Then pour," he said. "2 vodkas, neat, and a third, whatever she's having." He didn't look at the woman when he said she. He didn't need to. Everyone in the mechanism knew where everyone else was. Jack's stomach turned. Vodka, neat, not weird on its own. But the way he said it, like a phrase with a second meaning, made Jack feel like he'd stepped onto a stage and missed his cue. He reached for the bottle, poured 2 clean measures into 2 glasses. The clear liquid caught the bar's warm light and turned it into something colder. He set them down. The thick-necked man didn't touch his. The tall man didn't either. They just watched the surface of the vodka, as if waiting for it to ripple. Jack turned to make the woman's drink. Gin and tonic. Easy. And as he reached for the ice scoop, the back hallway clicked again. This time, not a latch, a soft metallic scrape, like something being slid across metal. Jack's hand froze mid-scoop. He felt the tall man's gaze lock onto him. "Don't," the tall man said quietly. Jack forced himself to finish the motion, to keep the ice from spilling. He set the scoop down with exaggerated calm. "What's back there?" Jack asked, and immediately hated himself for speaking at all. The tall man's smile returned, thin. "Precise. A door," he said. "And on the other side of that door, consequences." The thick-necked man finally lifted his glass, held it up to eye level, not drinking, just aligning it with the mirror behind Jack. For a second, Jack saw his own reflection framed in the vodka's curve, distorted and trapped. Then the woman's purse buckle flashed again. But this time it wasn't aimed into the mirror. It was aimed toward the hallway, and the scrape behind the door stopped, as if whoever was back there had received the message. Jack's pulse hammered. He kept his face blank the way bartenders do when couples fight in public. The tall man slid a folded piece of paper across the bar. Not an envelope, just a small square, neatly creased. "Put that," he said, "under the register." Jack stared at it. His mind screamed, "Don't touch it." But another part of him, the part that had learned how violence works without ever seeing a gun, understood that refusing would not end the night cleanly. Jack picked up the paper with 2 fingers, as if it might stain him. He lifted the register drawer, slipped it underneath, and shut it. The tall man nodded. "Satisfied." "Good," he said. "Now you're helping?" Jack's mouth went dry. "Helping who?" The tall man leaned in so close Jack could smell winter air on his coat, like he'd brought the street inside. "That depends," he murmured. "On which side finds you first?" And in the mirror, Jack saw it, finally, unmistakably. The coat on the back hook wasn't just shifting. Someone was standing behind it, close enough that the fabric breathed, watching, waiting, and Jack understood with a clarity that made his knees go weak. Whatever was happening tonight, the drink order was only the handshake. The real exchange was about to happen, through him, around him, and maybe on top of him, whether he wanted it or not. The coat didn't move again, but Jack could feel the presence behind it, the way you could feel a storm before it broke. Pressure without sound, air that suddenly seemed heavier than it should have been. He kept his eyes on the bar top, on the small rituals that let him pretend the world was still ordinary. Wipe, pour, slide, smile. The tall man's vodka sat untouched like a threat that had learned patience. The woman's gin and tonic remained at the exact angle she'd placed it, her fingers loose around the glass as if she were only here to watch other people panic. Jack forced a laugh at something he didn't hear, then leaned down as if searching for a dropped bottle cap. In the mirror, the coat hook was a little too full, fabric bulging where no shoulders should have been. Behind him, the tall man spoke softly, almost kindly. "You got any specials tonight?" Jack didn't look up. "Same as always." "Say it," the man murmured. Jack's throat tightened. A script? A line he didn't know. He stalled with motion instead, grabbed a stack of coasters, squared them, turned one a quarter turn by accident. The thick-necked man noticed immediately. His hand moved, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to cover the folded paper's edge where it would have been visible beneath the register if someone leaned at the right angle. Protective, Automatic. The woman finally shifted. She reached into her purse and drew out a lipstick, unscrewing it with slow precision. The cap clicked once. From the hallway, the scrape returned, short. Controlled, like someone adjusting a metal latch without opening it. Jack's mind tried to make it smaller than it was. A drunk in the back. A coat settling. A coincidence. But the room kept answering his excuses with choreography. The woman applied lipstick without looking at her reflection. She watched Jack. Then she set the lipstick down on the bar, upright, perfectly centered on a coaster, a signal marker. Jack felt the tall man's gaze press against his skull. Specials. The man repeated. Just tell me the specials. Jack swallowed. He needed something, anything that belonged to his world, not theirs. A rule, a routine, a lever he understood. He pivoted toward the far end of the bar where the jukebox sat half-broken and glowing. Special tonight is the jukebox actually working, he said, raising his voice a notch. Loud enough to be casual, loud enough to be heard. He crossed the room with a bottle rag in his hand, like that was all it was. The woman's purse buckle flashed once in the mirror. The thick-necked man's knee angled toward the hallway. The tall man stayed still, letting his stillness do the work. At the jukebox, Jack knelt and pretended to fuss with the coin slot. His fingers slid under the metal lip and found something taped there. Fresh tape. Neat edges, placed by someone who'd done it before. A thin strip of paper. Numbers, tiny and precise, not a song list. Jack's mouth went dry. He didn't take it. He just let his fingertip brush the edge as if confirming it existed. Then he stood and turned back with a practiced bartender's shrug. Needs a kick, he said. Behind the bar, the folded paper under the register felt heavier now, like it had gained gravity. The tall man watched Jack return, eyes calm, voice soft. Funny thing about old places, he said. They keep secrets in the walls. Jack set a clean glass down too hard. It clinked sharp in the quiet. The woman lifted her gin and tonic at last and took a sip. Slow, deliberate, then spoke for the first time. Her voice warm enough to pass for friendly. Jack, she said, like they'd met before. Jack froze. He hadn't told them his name. And in the hallway, something clicked. Final, decisive, like a lock turning from the inside. Jack forced himself to breathe through his nose, the way he did when a brawl was about to spill over. Slow air in, slow air out, because panic had a sound, and sound was what these people lived on. He reached for a bar towel and started wiping a glass that was already clean. His mind replayed the woman saying his name, searching for the mundane explanation like a man groping for a handrail in the dark. Name tag? No. Regulars. None who knew him well enough to bring strangers. A credit card slip left face up. He never did that. The only thing with his name on it was the schedule sheet pinned in the back hallway. His eyes flicked, just once, toward the corridor. The door to the storeroom sat half an inch ajar, exactly the way he always left it when he planned to go back in 10 seconds. But he hadn't been back there all night. The tall man leaned closer, elbows on the bar, voice lowered to something intimate. "You're doing great," he said, as if soothing a nervous employee. "Just keep doing what you always do." That sentence was the real threat. Keep the routine. Don't improvise. Don't alert anyone. Be the bar. Behind him, the thick-necked man reached into his coat and produced a matchbook. He placed it on the bar, spine aligned perfectly with the edge, too perfect for casual fingers. The cover read, "Lakeview Inn" in faded blue. Jack's place. He flipped it open with one thumb and slid a single match out halfway, leaving it protruding like an antenna. The woman's gaze tracked the movement, then drifted toward the hallway again. She tapped her fingernail once on her glass. One. The tall man didn't move, but the muscles in his jaw tightened, like he just heard a cue in an earpiece. From the hallway came the smallest possible sound, the soft scrape of paper against wood. Someone was tearing something down, removing something, cleaning. Jack felt his stomach drop, because it meant he'd been right about the schedule sheet, and that meant someone back there wasn't hiding. They were working. He made a decision that didn't feel brave, just necessary. He picked up the empty ice scoop and spoke in the loud, careless voice he used for customers who couldn't hear over the jukebox. "Outta ice," he announced to no one in particular. "Gotta run back." He didn't wait for permission. He moved, fast enough to look annoyed, not scared. The tall man's hand shot out, not to grab him, but to touch the bar towel, stopping it from sliding, as if giving himself an excuse to stand. He was rising without rising. Jack cut behind the counter, slipped past the soda gun, and entered the hallway. The smell changed immediately. Beer gave way to dust and old cardboard. The storeroom door was open wider now. The schedule sheet on the wall had been lifted at one corner, as if someone had peeled it back and pressed it down again. Under it, Jack saw a thin rectangle of fresh tape, metallic sheen beneath the paper, a wafer-thin object tucked flush to the drywall. Not a bug with wires, not Hollywood, something flatter, simpler, designed to be missed. A footprint scuffed the floor near the mop bucket. Wet, recent, leading deeper into the storeroom. Jack's heart hammered once, hard, then steadied as his body decided the only way through fear was forward. He stepped inside. The shelves loomed like dark ribs. On the back wall, between cases of bottled tonic and a spare keg coupling, a small black case sat on a crate that hadn't been there yesterday. Its lid was cracked open just enough to reveal coiled cable and a compact device with a dial, like a portable radio, but not the kind that played music. A receiver, an ear. Jack's skin prickled. Then, behind him, the hallway light clicked off. The storeroom plunged into shadow, except for a narrow line of light under the door, like a blade. A voice spoke softly from the darkness inside the room, close enough that Jack felt it more than heard it. "You weren't supposed to come back here." Jack didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the faint glow of the dial on the device, and he realized, with cold clarity, that the bar wasn't just being watched. It was being used as a relay point, a cutout space where ordinary noise could hide a signal, and now he was standing in the middle of it. Jack kept his hands visible, palms half open at waist height like a man trying to calm a skittish animal, and stared at the faintly lit dial on the device as if it were the only honest thing in the room. "I was just getting ice," he said. His voice sounded steadier than he felt, which told him his body had already chosen survival over dignity. The shadow inside the storeroom didn't answer. It shifted, cloth against cloth, someone changing their stance, adjusting their angle to the door, to him, to the thin line of light that still sliced under it. Jack could picture the geometry without seeing it. One person between him and the shelves, another outside, a third by the bar, the kind of spacing that wasn't instinct. It was practice. He glanced, just once, at the wall where the schedule sheet hung. The corner had been lifted and pressed back down. Too neat. Under it, the strip of tape held that wafer-thin rectangle tight to the drywall. A pickup, a contact point, a way to know who was working and when. Names and hours turned into routes. The voice in the dark finally spoke. Patient as a priest and colder than one, "You're not in trouble," it said, which in Jack's experience meant the opposite. "You're simply in the way?" Jack swallowed. "Then I'll get out of the way." Not yet. The word landed like a hand on the back of his neck. From the front of the bar, faint through the door, he heard laughter, too loud, too timed. A table of regulars forcing normalcy into the room because normalcy was a curtain that could be pulled over anything. The jukebox clicked, a record needle catching, and the music resumed in the next room as if the building itself had decided to lie. Jack's mind raced for something that wasn't heroic, just workable. People always imagine danger as a sprint. Most of the time it was a conversation with a locked door. He shifted his weight and let the ice scoop clatter softly onto the crate beside the black case. A small noise, nothing dramatic, but it gave him a fraction of a second to watch the shadow flinch, not from fear, but from calculation, like a man checking whether sound belonged to the bar's normal rhythm. Jack used that fraction. He reached forward, not toward the device, but toward the old telephone junction box mounted near the keg line, one of those metal boxes nobody cared about unless the lights went out. A fat bundle of wires fed into it, and Jack knew it like he knew his own hands because he'd fought with it a dozen times when the bar's phone died. He popped it open with his thumbnail and yanked the main plug. The bar phone line went dead. So did whatever else had been riding on that line. In the darkness, the receiver's dial on the black case flickered, one heartbeat of instability, then steadied, but not cleanly. The hum inside it changed pitch, thin and angry, like a radio trying to lock onto a station that had just moved. The shadow moved fast now. A hand came out of the dark, grabbing Jack's wrist. Not hard enough to break, but hard enough to promise it could. "You shouldn't do that," the voice said. Closer, no longer pretending to be gentle. Jack didn't pull away. He leaned into the grip as if stumbling, and with his free hand he swept the bar towel off a shelf. Glass shattered somewhere behind him, bottles going down in a clumsy cascade. A mess? A sound that couldn't be contained. The laughter in the main room cut off mid-breath. Then a chair scraped. Then another. Footsteps, real ones, approached the hallway. Jack felt the hand on his wrist loosen, just a fraction. Because crowds were unpredictable, and unpredictability was the enemy of clean exits. He used that loosen. He twisted, hard, and slammed his shoulder into the storeroom door as he shoved it open. Light flooded in from the hallway, harsh and ugly, and in that light, for half a second, Jack saw the face of the man who'd been in the darkness. Not a thug, not a drunk, but a neat, pale man with clipped hair and the expression of someone who'd spent years erasing his own reactions. His eyes weren't angry. They were offended, like a craftsman whose work had been touched. Behind Jack, the footsteps reached the hallway. Two of the regulars, big guys who did construction by day, drawn by the sound of breaking bottles like moths to a bulb. One of them blinked at the scene, confused, ready to become a witness without understanding he was being used as one. The pale man's gaze flicked past Jack to the regulars, then to the front door beyond, then to the bar, calculating exits the way some men calculated tips. He stepped back into shadow again, and the movement was so smooth it looked like the room swallowed him. Jack felt a rush of cold air as the man slipped past, brushing his shoulder with the faintest contact, an apology masquerading as collision. The pale man was gone, and the hallway suddenly felt too empty for how full it had been. From the main room, Jack heard the tall man's voice, too calm, calling out, "Everything okay back there?" Jack didn't answer. He stood in the doorway, chest rising and falling, and watched the black case on the crate. The receiver dial still humming, still trying to listen to something that had moved. One of the regulars stepped closer, eyes narrowing at the device. "What the hell is that?" Jack opened his mouth and realized the simplest truth was the most dangerous. If he said the wrong thing, he'd turn a bar fight into an espionage problem. So he said the only honest, ordinary sentence he had left. "I don't know," he whispered, "but it wasn't supposed to be here." Later, hours later, after the bar had closed, after Jack had mopped up the broken glass and scrubbed his hands until they stung, a different kind of knock came at the door. No rhythm this time. Just two firm taps. Two men in plain coats stood outside. No uniforms. No flashing lights. Their badges appeared only long enough to be believed. One of them looked past Jack into the dim bar and said quietly, as if they'd been listening long before tonight, "We're going to take that device now." Jack's throat tightened, and the people who brought it. The agent's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened, like a lens focusing. "They already know they made a mistake," he said, "and now they have to decide how much they're willing to lose to fix it." Jack watched them step inside, moving with a practiced economy that made the Lakeview Inn feel suddenly small. The bar had been a place for bad jokes, cheap drinks, and the kind of secrets people admitted only when they were drunk. Tonight, it had been something else, a listening post, a trap, a piece of a war that never announced itself. And Jack understood, in the quiet after the agents disappeared into the storeroom, that the scariest part wasn't that spies had come into his bar. It was that they had been there long enough to think of it as theirs.